It's Father's Day, and I love my father very much, but I want to tell you about a different man who is like a father to me. My family has been friends with another family for time out of mind. My dad and Crystal were college buddies. And so Crystal and Jim and my parents spent a tremendous amount of time together. And Crystal and Jim have 2 daughters, each a year younger than my sister and I. And so even though we lived in Vermont and they lived in Massachusetts growing up, we would see each other at least twice a year, if not more. In Vermont, we would do winter activities during February break, and in Massachusetts or somewhere in between, we would camp and hike in the summer, and we were always together. And when my parents separated, our family tradition had been on Thanksgiving to go to my grandmother's house, my dad's mother. And so that first year, my mom didn't have a place to go for Thanksgiving dinner, and so Crystal and Jim said, well, of course, you'll come to our house. And another tradition was born. And then, remembering how long ago it was that my parents separated, I realized that it's been over 20 years. So for over 20 years, my mom went to Crystal and Jim's house for Thanksgiving dinner. And on the years, every other year, you do that divorced parent swap thing. Every other year, my sister and I went with her. And we still saw Crystal and Jim and their daughters, Heather and Sarah, a couple times a year. And we would get together. And whenever we got together, those 2 families got together, the Kofke-Yeager family and my mom's sister and I, the Gorell girls. Poor Jim was the one man with all that sea of estrogen and baby estrogen. Poor Jim was the one man with 6 women, especially in more recent years. 6 women, powerful women, until finally some of us started dragging along some other guys and balanced it out for him a little bit. But for a long time, Jim held down the fort. And when my sister and I started to miss our dad, because we were at this gathering and he wasn't there, we looked to Jim, and he was dad for all 4 of us. We called him Rent-A-Dad. And he was my Rent-A-Dad. Even when we weren't at Thanksgiving dinner, even when we weren't visiting with them, I have another dad in Jim Egger, my Rent-A-Dad. And so on a Father's Day like this, I think of him. Now, Jesus tells this story, right, about the weeds and the wheat. And I was thinking about that this week for some reason. I was thinking about the parts of life that are like weeds and the parts of life that are like wheat, the parts of life that are fruitful and wonderful and exactly what we intend to have happen and that we rejoice over, and the parts of life that are bitter or annoying or painful or in the way. And this was not the lectionary text this week. It was a similar passage from Mark, and I swapped it out for Matthew so I could have this passage because I was thinking about it so strongly. And I was out in the garden this week, my little raised bed garden, because it was time to weed it a little bit and tend it and thin it. I mean, even like the stuff I want there, like you can't have the radishes grow too close together or they all end up like toothpicks, which is where they are right now. There's nothing to eat out in my garden yet. But I was out there and I was pulling out the weeds and pulling out the excess shoots in between the plants I wanted to keep. And I had this same problem that Jesus mentions in this passage, which is sometimes, especially the really, really small, tender plants that are just starting to come up, right? Like my carrots, which are just ridiculously tiny, and my lettuce, which I think is a lost cause. You can't really, first of all, tell if that little sprout is going to be a lettuce leaf or something else. But when you pull out something that you know is a piece of grass or something that's not supposed to be there, sometimes you disturb the beautiful, fruitful vegetable that you want to keep that's there because it's too close together, and so you can't quite pull it out, at least not until that vegetable is strong enough that it can hold on. Otherwise, when you pull out the weed, the good stuff that you wanted to keep is there. And Jesus tells this story, I think, in a beautiful way to help his disciples and to help us understand that life is like that, and that there are parts of life that are beautiful and fruitful that we want to keep, and there are parts of life that are painful and icky and we wish we could just get rid of. But if we try to pull those parts out, we might disturb the beauty that's there and the fruitfulness that's there. And so we can't quite separate them. The weeds and the wheat grow together in our lives. And I think we have a hard time understanding that. We want to understand, we want to have a worldview or a vision, a life, an experience where all we have is the wheat. The beauty, the joy, the hope, the promise, the tenderness, the fruitfulness, where that's life. We would love that. And we ask, why? Where did these weeds come from? And so, I can hear those workers turning to the farmer and saying, wait a minute, you're a good farmer. And you planted this field, God. You're a good farmer, and you planted this life. So where did all these weeds come from? And Jesus tells the story, and there's an enemy in the story, right? But the enemy is a personification, right? I think what sows the weeds is life itself. That's the way the world works, right? Nobody came into my garden and actually sowed seeds of weeds in my garden. They just blow there, because that's what they do. This is a raised bed. I'm trying very hard to control it. And still, the weeds get in. That's just what happens. That's the way things grow. So Jesus tells this story about how the enemy sows the seeds of pain and bitterness. But we know that that's a personification for brokenness and sin. Remember, I don't define sin as what we do, things we do, but that state of being separated from God and from one another. And that exists in the world. And so because that exists in the world, the seeds, the weeds just blow in, and they mix among the wheat and the vegetables and the things we really want to have there, and they grow together, and we can't pull them apart. It's not ours, as the workers, to pull them apart. Jesus says, let them grow. Let them grow that way, side by side. The wheat is not necessarily strong enough if we pull out everything around it to sustain that. I guess we could. We could try. There is a way, actually, I can tell you the secret to not having to feel the pain of the weeds in life, and that is to close off your heart and just not let anything in. Don't go in that garden. Don't walk through the field of wheat. And maybe, if you're lucky, it won't hurt so much then when the weeds do spring up. But it also won't be as beautiful. And it won't be as joyful. And life will be a little less bright and a little less full of love. So, we have the weeds and the wheat. And they're not ours to sort out. We have to let them grow together and trust them to God and God's servants when all is said and done, to separate weeds and wheat, joy and pain. Like I was saying to the children this morning on that last day of school, and I was there to pick up two magnificent young women, both of them excited about summer vacation, and both of them just devastated to say goodbye to their teacher. And I said, but that's because you love her. And you always will. You always. I remember my kindergarten and first grade teacher, right? You always will. You love that person. And if you hadn't let yourself love that person, then it wouldn't hurt as much. But you love that person. And so this is a wonderful moment. This is a beautiful thing. But yes, there's sorrow. Because we can't pry apart the weeds and the wheat. I want to give you an exercise to demonstrate how I think this is so important in our faith. So I want you, if you have a pew Bible in your pew, that's the red one, to open it up to page 579. And when you get to page 579, you should see a psalm that's very familiar. And if somebody would read me the first line of a psalm on page 579 of the pew Bible when you got it. Who's got it?
The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want.
The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Psalm 23, right? I presided at a memorial service yesterday a beautiful celebration of a woman's life. We read this psalm, right? We hear it a lot at memorial services. A psalm of comfort, a psalm of hope, right? God leads us, God protects us, God keeps our enemies from us, our cup overflows, and goodness and mercy follow us, and we dwell in God's house forever, right? A psalm that we associate with David, with King David, who may or may not have written it, but doesn't matter for our purposes. Somebody attributes this psalm to David, so we'll go with it. And we associate it also with Jesus, right? Our shepherd, who tends us and guides us and leads us, who protects us, with whom we don't have to fear. Y'all are putting them away. I'm going to have another exercise for you, so you're going to have to get back to that page, so don't go away yet. 579. Jesus, who gives us that promise that we will dwell in God's presence forever, right? Beautiful psalm of comfort and hope. But if you still have your book open to that page, or you've reopened your book to that page, there's a psalm that starts on the preceding page that is also very famous, also attributed to David, also intimately woven into the life of Jesus. Who wants to read the first line of Psalm 22? Go ahead, Joshua. My God, my God, why have you forsaken me? When does Jesus say that? On the cross. On the cross, right? In that moment. All intimately woven into his life and death. Later in the psalm it says, they divided my clothes among them, and for my raiments they cast lots. The soldiers at the foot of the cross. This incredible, powerful psalm of lament, of brokenness, of pain, side by side, page to page, with this psalm of hope and life and blessing. And my favorite Bibles in the world are ones like these, where those psalms are on facing pages, and when you close the book, those two psalms touch. The weeds and the wheat. We can't pull them apart. If David can experience both, if Jesus can embody both, Psalm 22 and Psalm 23, my God, why have you forsaken me? Surely I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. It's not ours to pull apart. On a beautiful, sunny Saturday in June, 2 years ago this past week, I was 6 weeks away from my due date with Will, and we had a party. Joy and laughter and family, love and blessing, and all the celebration of new life, almost entirely unmixed with sorrow, although there's a little. If you've experienced a pregnancy loss, then there's always that little bit, no matter how joyful, in that moment. But we had a party, we had a gathering of friends and family and friends who were like family at our house, and we laughed, and children were playing and running around, and it was a beautiful, perfect day, just like yesterday, 2 years ago, this past week. And we celebrated life's gift and the coming birth, such a great instance of joy. We'd invited the Kafkaeger family to come, but they weren't able to be there. You see, Jim Egger is one of the most amazing men I've ever known. He fought in a war. He conquered addiction. He worked with inner city youth. He built a house. He raised a family. He was a rent-a-dad when we needed one, and strong enough to put up with all of us. But cancer doesn't care about any of that. And so that same afternoon, 200 miles away, while my family and friends, as good as family, celebrated life, my rent-a-dad Jim passed away, with his wife and his daughters and his granddaughter at his side. The weeds and the wheat grow together. The lament and the hope are page to page, and when you close the book, they touch. The ecstatic joy and the deep pain and brokenness, they are side by side. They grow together, and they're not ours to pull apart. We could try. We could harden our hearts, but then we would miss so much. So all we can do is trust that in the end, when the full measure is taken, when we look back, when we step back and see, that the balance and the fullness of life tips toward tenderness and hope and joy and promise and blessing and goodness and righteousness and always, always, God's nature, God's name, always love. Amen.